Hey everyone, it's a new year. It's been a tumultuous one, really exciting, and I just wanted to speak to anyone who wants to listen about some thoughts I want to get off my chest, where I'm at. Last year I sort of became a bit of the bad boy in the energy debate. Lots of very strong critiques of, in particular, the market operators' integrated system plan, the sort of master plan, blueprint for Australia's energy transition to net zero. And I think been moderately successful at that in some ways, but also copped a lot of heat in other respects. In particular, the likes of Simon Holmes Accord have kind of basically made out that I'm just nitpicking, poking holes, sowing distrust, and not playing a constructive, positive kind of role in the debate. And as well, recently, like in another debate online just recently with Rosie Barnes, kind of went pretty hard at her for not thinking, I said, she volunteered it, very deeply about the ISP, and yeah, sort of, I think, went pretty hard at that. And it sort of feels like a tough and aggressive position that I have been taking, and I've got to sort of reflect on when that's the right thing to do, and when that's still where I want to be. Had a bit of a downtime over Christmas, etc., some time in the mountains, some time in Tassie, just recently now too. And lots of reflecting on what's happened towards the end of last year, in particular the parliamentary inquiries that have been going on that we've contributed really heavily to, and a whole bunch of evidence and testing that's come out before that. Also the Frontier report, Simon said, build a better model, and someone else tried, and that's received a lot of attention and a lot of flack in the debate for reasons I might get to. But I suppose I've got to address this question of whether I can be more nice and more constructive in the debate, and try to be honest about that. And I wanted to do this sort of face to camera to explain that the more I've sort of reflected on the role I'm playing in the debate and the type of research that's required and the evidence that I think has now emerged from all these inquiries, the short answer is no. I have been far too forgiving and kind, and swallowed my words and mumbled and fumbled the severity of what I think is an unbelievable scandal in the energy system. And I can't avoid, and I wanted to flag basically up front where I'm going with this. If people say that I'm poking holes and trying to sort of sink the credibility of the ISP, I wanted to share, put my hand up and say, guilty as charged. Having looked at what the ISP has now transparently become, I'm done poking holes. This ship needs to be burnt to the waterline and sunk, and a new one refloated, probably with a new crew on board. That's the devastating conclusion I've come to, is that it is just beyond salvage, beyond repair. And that's dramatic and damning and controversial and whatever else. And so here's my best sort of attempt to justify why that's got to, and I hope it's not exactly why you think. The real problem is not just because there's fatal technical flaws, which there are in the ISP. The problem now is that the ISP, now I think there is no chance that the ISP as it is, and the institution and the process has brought it to being what it is now, can escape very credible questionings as to whether it is still an independent, expertly prepared document. In fact, it's bizarre. It's far worse than that. Not only is it questionable, it's not just questionable whether it's independent. It is now unquestionable that it is wholly and completely subservient to the policy ambitions of the governments of the day. And that is a travesty. Because everyone would expect from the market operator and these experts that are set up to do this kind of deep, complex planning that we have better than that. And I think that it is just dawning now, in a horrendous way, how bad that actually is for the whole system. So it sounds radical, but just a few facts to kind of lay it out. The integrated system plan assumes that all government's policy is accomplished in every scenario that it contemplates. for its regulatory function for planning out this master plan. And that assumption for all of policy ambition being achieved is just absolutely absurd, particularly, and here's the clincher, right, for this 82% renewable energy target, right? Because that is the most driving, most dramatic, least realistic thing amongst all the targets that we currently have, I think, most substantial, right? Now, this target was made binding basically at the choice of AEMO, and it means that we're projected to have some absolutely spectacular takeoff in renewable energy production in the next 6 years. Nobody credibly, seriously thinks that's likely to happen. In fact, AEMO sponsored a report which did a workforce study. It requires like doubling and tripling critical parts of the workforce, like into the next 5 years, right, to get that done. Like these sorts of workforce gyrations mean that it just will not occur, even if there's no barriers from angry landholders or whatever else, or resistance, or there's perfect investment support, everything else so smoothly. It just will not occur. And yet, the ISP now fails to consider any scenario where it does not in their core scenarios that make up the ISP. And this is just a travesty. It's debased our debate completely. Now, myself and my team and a few others have been bleating into the wind about this for some time. It's no secret, for at least this year, or at least last year, it's been well known. But a few more things that have emerged about why I think this now fatally compromises the reputation of the ISP and the market operator. In particular, just before the final hearing of the Energy Planning Regulation in Australia Committee, the Senate inquiry basically, there emerged this FOI which we put out for. And this FOI revealed that basically not only was the market operator allowed to leave that as a free variable, because get this, they've always been claiming that their hands are tied, they have no choice, the rules and regulations bind them to assume that this occurs. That's been their argument defending this for so long. Not only were they allowed, they actually planned and proposed to leave that as a free variable and see what their optimization process had the renewable mix stack out at. And they had this email where the government basically, through the department, expressed a preference that it be binding in all scenarios. And they rolled over and they made it binding. So the defense that they've been tightly constrained and they're just following the letter of the rules has been utterly dismantled. And we've had the leaders, the most senior leaders, Merrin York and the CEO, Daniel Westerman, sitting in front of senators trying to explain this. And they've made out that they weren't aware of this, which is a problem in itself, but also pretending that nothing's wrong. This is just how it is. This is what the ISP has become. It's just an instrument that shows what's required to achieve government policy. This is a disaster, an absolute disaster. And to give you a personal anecdote, right? Part of the problem, and this is why I'm doing this, is that people like us that have read this and understand this, the gravity of this, that there is nothing more reputable behind that assumption we get to 82% than the Reputex report that was commissioned by Labor before they won office, right? The same one that told us $275 was coming off our bills. That was where the 82% came from. That is all that's driving pretty much everything about what the ISP does in the next, certainly 6 years, but it pretty much colours the result for the whole damn thing. Right? So we have to do this process now. We go around on Twitter and say, whenever someone says something about what the ISP shows us is that in this many years, this many coal plants will close. So what the ISP shows us is that at this point, we'll already have reached 95% renewables. And we have to basically play this horrible bad cop role and say, no, that's not an objective analysis. That is simply the application of a Labor Party ambition that came from this Reputex document that has been forced upon all the other modelling, all the other credible hard work and consultation, all the good stuff that AEMO plausibly has in the ISP, has been force-fit to fit the mould of a completely discredited, politically partisan ambition. There is nothing objective about that anymore. And it's horrible, and I don't like doing it, but it's essential that people, when they use this report, which has become basically the sword and shield of the current government, right? Like they're saying, hey, we're following the experts. How dare you question the experts? The independent experts show that. And there's now pretty much nothing that can follow. What does the ISP show now? What can you say that it actually shows? Other than what a set of governments, mostly Labor governments, and Matt Keane, etc., wish the future would be. All of that credible expertise, objectivity has been annihilated by that fact. And it's painful, right? Like, so now we can't even say that this is when coal will close, because that's only when coal will close if that Reputex fairy tale comes true. Like, this is how much carbon we're on track to reduce. No, nobody thinks we can do that. That is only the Reputex kind of report that imagines that's possible. That's totally discredited. Like, there is now all this stuff, like, base load's going to be gone really soon. None of that checks out. It all has to be completely dismantled and pushed back against. And I'm tired of being the bad cop, right? AEMO needs to come out and admit that this is nothing like an assessment of what is optimal. It's nothing like an assessment of what is affordable. It is now worse than useless. It basically makes something that is unforeseeable ambition, like just not on the charts of realistic, some sort of objective, basically accomplished fact. And people like poor Rosie is just kind of like, hey, get off my back about this ISP stuff. Stop telling me what I think and why I think it. And I'm kind of like, I get it. You shouldn't have to think very hard to take what should be an objective and reputable report and say, here, look at this chart. It says something about where we're headed. And it's a travesty that it now says nothing about where we're headed. So now I think that the ISP is like, it's beyond discredited. Everything else that it says, like, we can't now say it says. Even the last thing, like, about it being reliable. We've got a reliable system here. That depended on gas, and finally we've had AEMO coming out clearly and saying, in the worst weather conditions, we rely on gas to back it up. And guess what? That doesn't work either. And like, thanks to the Simsauser report that's come out just a few days ago, right? Like, that said, no, that peaking role, our gas infrastructure would not support that functionality. We're going to have blackouts in New South Wales and Victoria unless we massively upgrade stuff that is not commercially feasible to upgrade, we currently think. So, like, this is literally, we've got blackouts coming if we follow the current plan, and we don't know what it will cost to fix it, and we certainly don't have a plan to fix it yet. Damning fatal flaws. Right now, I can see there's a tiny stretch of an argument where you say, okay, a technical flaw, but best efforts, Aidan, aren't they going to fix that? Can't we be constructive and help them get along with that? And this is where, again, I wish I could be the nice guy, but I can't. Because those fatal flaws were identified in a report that the government commissioned back in 2022. And by January 2024, this report was finished, okay? It was in the government's hand, and it identified that this gas infrastructure was not going to check out, that the assumptions would not provide us the gas that they was assumed to in the ISP. The fatal flaw was known about by the government at the same time that everyone else is putting in their submissions and calling out other fatal flaws, like the assumptions about consumer energy resources just being magicked into existence, that consumers would buy all this stuff and give it back to the grid, and that didn't need to be costed. The same report says that's problematic, right? That is not adequately considering the trade-offs. All the stuff that we trusted about this being somehow optimal and tested, the government knew that it wasn't optimal, it wasn't tested, it wasn't realistic. And they put that report in the bottom of a drawer and ignored it for the whole damn year and sailed through and released the ISP with full fanfare, okay? Daniel Westman, everyone else coming out and saying, we found the optimal path, the least cost version to provide reliable, low-cost energy to consumers, reliable, affordable electricity, all the mantra. The evidence was already there that the mantra was rubbish, totally flawed. So how then can we go and say and keep trust in these institutions that have basically withheld evidence that they have fatal flaws in their model, not to mention it being a cast imprint, basically, of the Reputex Labor Party policy, with no testing of whether that makes sense, is feasible, economically optimal at all, right? How can we trust that this institution is still doing their proper mandatory functions, their statutory obligations to look after the long-term interests of consumers? Now, I just want to emphasize, I'm not trying to allege that people aren't doing their level best. I'm not trying to say that any person has acted with any malice or conspiracy here. But where we've got to is a place where I don't think the trust can be restored. And I'm just sharing shards of the arguments which have been exposed but not reassembled by the Senate inquiries. But every way I look at the evidence and see them putting back together, I cannot see a way in which the market bodies aren't hopelessly exposed to a very credible allegation that they have now become more or less an instrument of the government. One more point on supporting just that, right? Because it seems and it feels like they've now become just instruments of doing the government's will, not the consumer's will, which is looking after our interests, which is different, absolutely different, right? But as it turns out, there is crystal clear evidence that the government has openly, transparently tried to make it so, right? And this is what we have from basically a communique from the 28th of October 2022, which was a meeting of the Ministerial Council that governs energy, right? So this is all the ministers. It said that ministers, wait for it, tasked market bodies with taking all necessary measures to ensure the delivery of these nationally significant projects, targets, and plans. It's basically government ambition. Whatever we say we want to do, it includes the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan, this huge supergrid stuff. It includes both the Marinus cables and a totally unfeasible timeline. It includes VNI West, and offshore wind in Victoria, which is horrendously expensive and is nowhere near the least cost version. All these things that are ministers' ambitions that are plucked out of the air. Ministers have tried to tell the market bodies, it's your job now to take all necessary measures to make this happen. This is a total and utter disgrace. Tasking these bodies, like all those ministers, they have their own government departments who can and should be tasked with doing that. The department's job is to do all necessary measures to bring about the government's ambitions and policies. The independent market bodies, they have an obligation to protect consumers' interests, which at times means they will have to push back on plans that don't stack up and don't make sense. So if they weren't on their feet objecting clearly to that instruction being given to them, frankly, they should resign. We cannot have any trust that they are actually doing their jobs properly. Now, I don't know. I hope that they were on their feet objecting. We don't have any kind of minutes from these meetings. We only have the communique from the ministers about what they want us to hear. And that doesn't register any objection from these market bodies, including Daniel Westerman, the CEO of AEMO. But now we know they've sat through hours and hours of grilling from senators and members of the parliament on all their processes and planning and regulatory structures. And they had parliamentary privilege throughout this. And if they wanted to get anything off their chest, that something was awry about what was going on, they've had their opportunity and stayed completely silent. So far as I can tell, utterly defensive and think that nothing is going wrong. Moreover than that, we get back and try to do some more work and submit to these processes and procedures in good faith, and there is no sign that they want to change things at all. Their plan for the next ISP is to change nothing, to make it a carbon copy again of every government ambition and policy being achieved, assumed successful in every scenario they assess. This is despite, and the Centre for Independent Studies put in a rule change request, right? And again, I don't think the rules are actually that broken. They don't have to behave this way under the rules, but we put in a rule change request to say, let's make it clear, please, that you do not have to do that. To be just agents of the government of the day, you need to think more broadly. You need to run proper baselines. At the moment, we know that the Market Commission won't deal with that till after the election. And we know that there is no plan at all from AEMO to preempt that something's wrong and something has to change. So given there is just not the slightest sign of any change, slightest sign of penitence, given there's been ample opportunity for the market bodies to call out and say that this situation is not really right, not really tenable, where do we go from here? How can we reach the conclusion that they are still doing their job to adequately represent consumers' interests? There is just no way now that we can say that the ISP is an instrument of some objective technical analysis, when all the significant technical efforts that have gone into that have been forced to comply with the assumption that government policy of the day is perfectly infallible. No other scenario is worthwhile considering. I just think there is no escape from this. And my concern is, like, and again, people want to sort of make out that I'm some sort of hit guy to tear down these good, hardworking people. And I wish I wasn't, because there's lots of very good, hardworking people that have genuine best intent about doing their best here. But rules have been broken, obligations have not been met. And I can't see how faith in these organisations can be restored, particularly the market operator and the ISP, without a total new leaf being turned. And I can't see how that doesn't mean resignations. Someone has to fall on their sword, I think, to create the conditions where we can say emphatically that the situation we're currently in has been repudiated in its entirety and things will move on. And why am I so emphatic that that has to happen? And I'm emphatic, by the way, that has to happen before the next election. And it's for this simple reason. If we go through the next election, we walk through the next few months, and there's a change of government, and there hasn't been an emphatic, complete repudiation of the situation we're currently in, which means abandoning the ISP as it currently is and the processes that have made it simply a vassal of the policy of the government today, is that I don't want it to be the situation where it becomes normal. When the new government comes in, and perhaps it's a Liberal government, and they just say, okay, now we get to have the market operator completely roll over and make all our assumptions seem infallible too. And that at the moment is exactly what would have to happen if we do not acknowledge that this is an untenable state for the energy debate to be in, to be guided by a vassal object of the ministers of the day. Because, hey, if the market operator never considers that a nuclear power plant could come online any later than what the government has set the ambition for it to be, that is not a smart way for us to plan our energy system. There has to be consideration of change of government, of risks and blowouts in timelines and schedules. That is essential, and is at least as essential in the new government if they want to do nuclear policy as well, to make sure that their ambition that says maybe we're going to be totally nuclear by the mid-2030s and hey, we'll reduce this much carbon, that I would wish, on the sake of someone who cares about nuclear, that could become more credible and more thoroughly tested than what we currently have today, which is assuming and giving a veil of credibility to the idea that we will have 82% renewable energy just in the next 6 years, which frankly is an absurdity. It just won't happen. And AEMO has done a disastrous disservice to debate, to allow their own brand and their own credibility and their own language like optimal to be wrapped around something which is simply government-sanctioned, government-planned pathways. They haven't tested its optimality at all. They've assumed that everything the government does is going to happen and rebadge that as optimal. And it's a disgrace, a total disgrace. And so they've put people like us in I think, a horrible position, which we don't want to be in, where we're trying to have a technical, a non-partisan engagement with the facts, engagement with the policies. And when we scratch what should be a neutral, technical, objective source of information, we find purely a partisan policy position with no serious technical founding behind it at all, underneath this supposedly independent technical position. We have to take a shot then at the partisanness of this. Our only option in the debate is to attack AEMO. And think about what this does, like to the debate with the politicians. This has completely debased our ability to have a serious and sophisticated energy debate when AEMO, the market operator, if Bowen keeps using them as sword and shield and saying, we trust the experts, this is the expert policy, he's a liar whenever he says that, right? Because the experts have said plain and clear, this is the policy that's given to us by the governments of the day. And then it makes it an even more impossible position with the opposition. The opposition has to say, now we can't go through and attack Chris Bowen's plan without first going through and drawing blood from the system operator, the market operator, who have put all their livery and branding around what is simply a Labor Party plan. This is a disaster for the civility of discourse, for the objectiveness of debate, for our ability to engage with facts separately from political ambitions, to keep things calm, to keep things sophisticated. It forces us to be the worst kind of versions of ourselves in kind of attacking everything that everyone uses from a source. The ISP can't be saved. It has to go. It's not because there aren't good people working on it and doing their level best, but their best efforts, if it's landed us here, are not good enough. It must be repudiated. It must be completely sunk, left under the sand, and a new ship, a new approach to energy planning and our technical organisations must be created in order for us to move forward and have the debate we need to have. Thanks.